The function, meaning, and mission of the world church. And what better place to debate this prospect than in a university understood as a crucible for smelting traditions and forging new ones in the community called the church. I thank you. And that is precisely my point. That, it's remained a very powerful statement that hasn't translated into reality. And if you ask me, I would say, as I mentioned last week, it will be the responsibility of Christians in Africa who are growing in their competence and expertise in theological matters. It will be a responsibility for them to take such declarations, or at least of intent, and envisage ways of translating that into reality. Because coming from the leadership, it is not going to happen.
But is there a way, you almost indicate that the clergy or the leadership doesn't recognize lay participation, whether I take that being female or male?
I would argue that it is still a very clericalist community, in which case there is much that is concentrated in the hands of the clergy, and which, as a result, marginalizes or excludes other members of the Christian community, whether men or women. Yes, that would be a basic point that I would be glad to see some exceptions. But, I can't find one to point out at this point.
It seemed to me the real struggle is to try to make all the things you've talked about more and more real and active in that, because the church in Africa is relatively young. In Zambia, they celebrated the 100th anniversary, yes, maybe 10, 15 years or 20 years ago.
Yes.
But it's European taught and very non-African. Mainly European missionaries and that, who had great goodwill and the rest, but conveyed theology and that was very un-African.
I would agree with you.
With exceptions.
Yeah, it's certainly there, and I would agree with you. The point I would add to it is that there is developing a consistent and a critical body of knowledge or scholarship that we could call African theology in Africa. And I would like to see how this can be a resource, not only to, in quotes, teach, but also to facilitate conversations about how we translate some of these ideas into reality. I would like to see a situation where there is more dialogue and conversation amongst the different constituent parts of the Christian community. And I'll be thinking theologians, I'll be thinking, lay groups, I'll be thinking the leadership, across the board. How we facilitate this kind of conversation. And I see that as a responsibility that I bear as a theologian. If it hasn't happened, then there's something I am not doing right. Because it's not enough to talk about these ideas or criticize these practices. someone needs to take responsibility for engaging the different, shall we say, parties in the Christian community, in a dialogue, in a process, in a conversation that allows us to practice more of this. And I think that's a responsibility that I bear as an African theologian. And then I'll move to this.
Given what you've said, and what preceded in your talk, that it's very difficult to take some cultural characteristics that might come from Western Europe in something called church and transplant that in a way to Africa and have that somehow become an African church. Having said that, and you've laid out what needs to happen, why is it not happening?
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a very important point, which I will tie with what you just contributed. It is not happening for several reasons. First, I would say, as he just pointed out, the church that is taught and that has received values or principles from the, shall we say, the European church. And those are principles and values that are infused with certain tendencies towards clericalism, for example. It's very strong. And in a situation where that is strong, it undermines the creativity or the responsibility that the rest of the Christian community can take. It undermines, for example, subsidiarity in ministry, for example, in theological scholarship, for example, in exercising leadership, for example. So I would like to say that that is one clear reason why it is not happening. And I don't want to criticize the leadership of the Christian community on the continent needlessly. But I would like to say that we do have a leadership that is still very, very Roman, in the sense that some of the values that I would have considered as positive contributions to global Christianity coming from the church on the continent would be questioned by certain in the leadership of the Christian community, be it in liturgical celebration, be it in theological scholarship, or even in areas of ministry in the church. So we face a task to undergo what one of my colleagues who's sitting here has called conversion, a conversion process that would involve rethinking the Christianity that we receive, the catechesis that we receive. And I believe that the Christianity that I practice as an African has to smell the smell of the earth that I grew up in on the continent. Otherwise, it will not stick.
Just to follow up on that, I'm really pressed to do that. It seems to me that by taking the values of the European church and trying to make them African, one is taking a secondary source rather than a primary source of Christian belief and practice and perspective. And maybe the lesson is to go back to the early church and to the Testament itself, rather than the secondary source, which has been greatly modified over time by a particular history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there was a time when we were not allowed to drum in the church. We were not allowed to drum in the church. We were not allowed to use musical instruments from the continent in the church because we were told these are artifacts of your pagan upbringing.